Hello and welcome to one of the longest videos I've made in quite a while. My name is GiBi and I'm going to be reading the Anaxis/Lane-Shoe Manifesto. This is an article that was posted on the Quickie by one of the members of the Watchmen. Now before I go into this, I do want to give a quick disclaimer. Now this video is going to be difficult to cover for two reasons. The first is my own biases. My own memories of the situations that occurred many years ago, my own interpretations of the communications I had with the people involved in this story. And then the second reason is going to be the biases of the narrator, of the person whose account we're going to actually be reading. Obviously, when a lot of people tell their stories, especially to the public about an incident like this after the fact, they tend to tell it in a way that makes them look better in retrospect. So, just so that you're totally aware, when I'm telling stories about my own involvement, myself in the past, obviously you need to keep in mind that subconsciously or unconsciously I may be telling it in a way that makes me look better, and that the narrator of this piece may also be doing the same. All of that to say, take this with a very large grain of salt. A little background and history on the Watchmen. They were the group that took over from the guard dogs as the de facto protectors of Chris Chan. They were not affiliated with the Kiwi Farms as the guard dogs had been. The guard dogs consisted of people like Noel and Marvin and other people who had been in the Chris story for a long time. The Watchmen consisted of people who were new to Chris story, or at least weren't in it for the last 20 years. It's my belief that the Watchmen were actually good for Chris, that they were actually there to protect him and to be his friend. I actually think that these people formed a genuine bond and friendship with Chris. With that said, obviously I disagreed with their methodology. Part of them being friends with Chris meant that they fed into his delusions. They all pretended to be CPU goddesses just like him. They all referred to him using his fake goddess name. They all talked to him about these imaginary characters that he talked about as if they were real. Now, it's all well and good for me to criticize them for doing this, when I was never in charge of taking care of Chris. I can sit here on my high horse and say that you should never feed into his delusions. But if the options are feeding into his delusions, or letting him fall victim to people like the idea guys again, I honestly do not know what I would have done, and thankfully I've never been in that situation. Thankfully, the only people who have ever been in that situation are the couple of people who made up the Watchmen. It's very possible that the Watchmen contacted me at some point before my first public interaction with them. My first public interaction with them was MKR leaving a comment on one of my videos, basically telling me to stop bullying her friend Christine. I don't know if the comment is still up because he ended up getting banned from the Kiwi Farms, but actually the very first mention of me on Kiwi Farms was by Not, one of the leaders of the Watchmen. He was unfavorably comparing me and Dylan Thomas, another Chris YouTuber, and basically calling us a bunch of names. Not and I would end up forming a professional relationship in the future as we discussed things about Chris. After MKR reached out to me on my video, we got in contact with each other. Basically, her main criticisms were that I was very unknowledgeable about a lot of Christory. She recommended that I read through the Quickie and stop speculating on a lot of things. Obviously, back in the day, I did a lot of speculation pieces, and I still actually stand by a lot of those. A lot of things as far as Chris's mental state or the future of Chris's actions are things that I'm still interested in discussing. The problem is I didn't have all the facts of the past, meaning I was speculating on things that were known. That was my major flaw back then, and that is what MKR wanted me to fix. Around this time, the Watchmen reached out to me. They had audio that they had secretly recorded of Jacob Sockness. Now, I don't specifically remember if when they reached out to me they said that they were the Watchmen, or if they just said that they were an anonymous group. Either way, at the time, I did not put two and two together that the people I was talking to were the Watchmen, were Not an MKR and the other people involved. They told me that I could release this audio of Jacob as long as I cut out all of their dialogue for their privacy, and I thought that this was a very fair thing. It was very important that this audio be released to the public, but these people wanted to protect their privacy, so I re-recorded their lines, and those videos are still up on my channel. Most of my interactions with the Watchmen regarded the safety of Chris. They would also give me information that wasn't necessarily public knowledge, such as Chris had 2 cell phones. That has since become public knowledge. Based on the things that would come later, it was very obvious that they were trying to steer the public perception of Chris in a more positive light. With that said, that positive light was actually more truthful. A lot of people had a lot of misconceptions about Chris because he exploded in popularity when Gino started releasing his documentary, meaning a lot of people only knew about the early days of Chris because only the first couple of episodes had come out by then. People were treating late 2010s Chris as if he was early 2000s Chris. So one of the things that the Watchmen wanted to get across was that Chris was a relatively normal person, that he would have game nights, that he would have movie nights with his friends, that he left his house and did a lot of activities around town. He was not this recluse, he was not this person who just sat on his computer all day terminally playing video games and spending time on the internet. Around the time, the big Chris tubers would have been Gino Samuel, myself, Dylan Thomas, and Rogue Internet Man, and I think that we all fell into our own individual niche. Gino obviously released his documentary in a very objective fashion, never putting in his own commentary, trying to steer clear of his own opinion. Obviously, he eventually would have to make executive decisions about how to cover the story, which technically includes some bias, but he was trying to remove as much bias as possible. I was also trying to present stories in as factually a way as possible, but that included a lot of speculation. My own biases would shine through with what I thought was happening or what I thought would happen in the future, not so much my own interpretation of what was happening, if that makes any sense. Dylan Thomas was a lot more comedic. His videos were about the insanity in the Sonic the Hedgehog community, and so when he covered Chris Chan, it was from the perspective of ridicule. At the very least, that is my and other people's interpretation, but I'm not going to put words in his mouth that was his intention. So because at the time the Watchmen were actually Chris's friend, they very much enjoyed me and Gino's content and not so much Dylan's, because Dylan was mean to Chris. At one point, MKR reached out to Dylan and told him that she would share all of this undercover Chris Chan info, these leaked documents, all of this evidence that had not been shown to the public with him, if he was nicer to Chris. She used me as an example, basically saying that they had helped my career, they had given me information because I was playing along and being nice to Chris. This is factually untrue. While it may be the case that they gave me things like the leaked Jacob audio because I was nice to Chris, at no point did they tell me to be nice to Chris. That was just always my MO. I always went out of my way to discuss things in a factual manner and only allow the joke of the situation to be presenting things just factually as they are. Chris's inane and insane ramblings are funny. I didn't have to layer jokes on top of them. It's also, I think, extremely dishonest to say that they helped my career in giving me the leaked Jacob audio, as those videos to this day performed significantly worse than my other videos about Chris Chan. Me simply reading his public Twitter account got way more views than these leaked Jacob audios. Basically, MKR was implying to Dylan that I had taken some sort of deal, and that it was helping my career, and so he should take the same deal, and he refused. The two got into a sort of argument. There were a lot of insults and swear words passed back and forth. I found myself in the middle of it when people on Twitter started directing me in the direction of this argument that was happening, and I, unfortunately, defended MKR, or at the very least, I painted Dylan as the bad guy by saying that he struck the first blow. This was in reference to the fact that Dylan called MKR a very not nice word that starts with the letter C and is 4 letters long. This is just the old-fashioned Sunday school teacher in me, but I don't appreciate when you call a lady words like that. With that said, in a very factual manner, you could very well be argued that MKR was the one who threw the first punch by originally threatening Dylan. Basically, the conversation was MKR sending a veiled threat, and then Dylan responding with a very non-veiled, overt, antagonistic approach. So while I stand by my opinion at the time, in hindsight, I definitely need to take the L on that one. Later on, there would be a massive schism within the Watchmen as one of the members, Wildcat, took over. One of the things that had happened is that Knot was banned by the Kiwi farms, and so Wildcat used this and various other just instances of events that had gone down over the years to convince Chris to stop talking to Knot and MKR. So Wildcat took over. Wildcat at this time was actually in the same Discord as Bella, the person who would go on to leak the Chris Chan audio where he admitted to the terrible, horrific crimes that he allegedly committed with Barb. Wildcat was an unassuming stooge in Bella's plot. This man thought that he could basically control Chris. He thought that he would be able to be in control of the Watchmen, the Praetors, and Bella's chess club. Instead, he was just a useful idiot for them. At the time, he still had some of the Watchmen members on his side, but as it became clear that he was an idiot, they started leaving him one by one, and Bella used him as a scapegoat. After Wildcat reached out to me personally to tell me that he had overthrown Knot and would be my new liaison to the Watchmen, I became extremely suspicious. For one, I had no reason to believe that Knot had done anything wrong from the information I'd been given, and for two, I didn't really have a liaison to the Watchmen. I just kind of would very friendlily I just kind of had very friendly conversations with MKR, and if anything came up, she would give me information. The way he talked to me was as if this was some kind of legitimate business transaction, which is, again, kind of how it was painted to the public in order to make them look more legitimate, but was not actually how things worked in reality. That's not actually how my communications with them went. So when he approached me with that mindset, it made me think that he didn't really know what was going on. I immediately DM'd MKR on Twitter to ask her what had happened, and she gave me, again, biased from her perspective, the information that Knot had been kind of banned from the Kiwi farms, kicked out of Chris's life, and that this guy, Wildcat, had taken control. Wildcat actually started doing interviews that were then posted on the Quickie. It was of MKR's opinion, at least that she expressed to me, that now the Quickie was under his control. He wasn't actually like the lead moderator or anything, but because of his connections and because of his new position of power, he was able to sort of steer the conversations in ways that benefited him. This led to a several-day period in which I basically no longer trusted the Quickie. This, of course, coincided early with the Bella leaked audio stuff. My last real communications with any of the Watchmen happened in the days following the leaked audio. I spoke to MKR about if she knew anything about it. She said that she had no idea and would never have suspected that Chris would do something as horrible as this. She then went back in their chat logs and found that Chris mentioned Bella as a person several times. He had mentioned her name, but nobody in the Watchmen had ever thought that she was important. And then it became clear that she was. At this time, Wildcat was still in contact with me, and he was giving me insider information. Insider information that I was not trusting, because at the time, I thought that he was the ringleader of the whole gang. All of the chess club members in Bella were his underlings, that he was in control of the Quickie, that he was in control of these people who had this leaked document of Chris. I thought that he was this idea guy level mastermind. And because of this, because I thought I had this insider information, I tried to reach out to people on the Kiwi farms in order to tell them what had happened. I regret my actions on the Kiwi farms simply because I totally misread the room. I kind of went in and approached them and talked to them as if they were the B-board on 4chan, or as if they were funny junk, or as if they were forums that I used to go on in the early 2000s in which people called each other the F-slur in terms of endearment. And they're not like that. They're very much, or at least nowadays, are very much the people I interacted with, a lot more like Reddit. For everyone on the Kiwi farms who sent me very mean messages, I had an equal amount of people who sent me messages apologizing for the culture of the website, how it didn't used to be like that, and how it was now basically taken over by these power-hungry would-be Reddit mods. So again, big L on my part. I would not do that again if I had the opportunity. I totally misread the room. So at the time, I had made a tweet and basically said, hey, anyone on the Kiwi farms, anyone who's doing a legitimate investigation into this leaked audio, reach out to me. And then they didn't, so I went right to the source. I went to Kiwi farms. I eventually got into contact with one of the main players on that board, and I basically told him my theory that Wildcat was in charge, and then I sent him a bunch of leaked documents. He would end up turning against me, and his stated reason is that I had drawn public attention to him, basically naming him in some of my videos, and saying that he was, like, in control of the board. This is complete nonsense, because another YouTuber who was covering the events at the same time, Kami D-Girl, also thanked him as a public-faced member of the board, as one of the people leading the investigation. So that was a complete lie. So the Kiwi farms put two and two together, one of the twos being that I was antagonistic to them on the board because I misread the room, and the other two being that I had leaked information I refused to share with them, that I had this sort of sense that I knew more than them, that being the information I'd gotten from MKR. They put two and two together and assumed that for some reason I was working with Bella. One of the only users to ever get banned from my Discord server for just being very vile and harassing other people, then went to Kiwi Farms to try to defend me. I banned him for being inappropriate, and he went to the Kiwi Farms of his own volition literally months after being banned. I tell this whole story because it's important to my last communications with the Watchmen, in which MKR reached out to me on Twitter and asked me if all the things she had been reading about me were true. Had I actually sent an army of my fans to defend myself on Kiwi Farms? The answer, of course, was no. At the time, the Kiwi Farms was doing their own investigation into the Watchmen. They had evidence, and I don't fully understand it, but they had evidence that the person who had drawn my initial profile picture on YouTube was actually one of the Watchmen. In order to gather more evidence on this or to debunk it, I went into my own DMs to try to find the person who had drawn that image and found that they had deleted the conversation. Long story short, the theory is that this was in fact the Watchmen, and that before they made public contact with me, they wanted to face dox me. So they asked me for a picture of myself so they could draw a profile for me. This was completely unnecessary, given that I had shown my face in videos prior to this, but that is the going theory. I brought this up to MKR, and she called me an a-hole. And so ends my contact with the Watchmen. The guy, Wildcat, ended up disappearing from the internet, and I leaked a bunch of our DMs to show and kind of prove my point that he was bad news the whole time. And that leads us to the Lane Chu Manifesto, written by Anaxis, who was one of the Watchmen members. Anaxis had actually been one of the few people who joined Wildcat's side after the schism. He then cursed out Wildcat, called him an idiot, and then stopped associating with him after it came to light what Wildcat had been doing. All of that to say, this is his perspective on what had been happening. This is some insider scoop knowledge that we did not previously know up until this point. But the story I just told, is the public knowledge that we did have on these actors. So now we're going to read what he wrote. The following is my personal story about how I got involved with the Quick community, became a member of the Watchmen, was exiled from the group, closely observed Chris for about a year, mid-2020 to mid-2021, and ultimately ended my involvement due to events surrounding the incest scandal. Much of my tale will be framed around the events of the 30th of July, 2021, and I will go into extensive detail about my experiences. Not all of it will necessarily directly involve Chris, with focus also being given to Chris's orbiters and members of interest in the community. This is not meant to be an objective article summarizing events by any means. It is all very subjective, and while I aim to keep as many facts as possible intact, I acknowledge that some of it may be colored by my own personal biases. That is just unavoidable when writing something from this personal of a perspective. I will be providing as many screenshots as I can to help contextualize and prove my claims. I will be as truthful as possible regarding myself and my actions, as I don't have anything to hide. However, I will occasionally keep certain names out of these events, as many people who were adjacent to myself at this time have little or nothing to do with the events that transpired around Chris. Lastly, if you want full context, then please read the whole page and follow it as it's updated. I know it's a lot, but this isn't something I feel can get an accurate TLDR while still maintaining the full truth. It is far too complicated a subject for that. Thank you for reading and for your patience. Forward. 30th of July, 2021, a day that would forever live on in infamy and scar the minds of Christorians the world over. Referred to sometimes as the 9/11 of the internet. This was the day that a recording was released which revealed Chris's incestuous relationship with his mother. Soon after, Chris was arrested and jailed, his fate left in the hands of the Virginia judicial system, and Kiwi Farms was left to investigate the actors that were involved in the creation and release of this recording, resulting in the discovery of the troll Isabella Loretta Janke, otherwise known as Bella. Along with her came the revelation of a cabal of sadistic trolls that surrounded her, as well as horrific details about her life and seemingly cruel and sadistic personality. Certain individuals who got involved with her were also placed under scrutiny, including the Sutress and Sean Walker. Sean Walker being the Wildcat that I referred to earlier. And because my username was found as part of a group chat in which Bella was interrogated, I suddenly found myself caught in the crossfire of angry Kiwis who were searching for someone to blame. I have since been subject to many rumors and incomplete or outright false statements, so in an effort to tell my story and clarify what transpired from my perspective, I have decided to write about it here. I was the third individual to play the role of Lane Chu the Chronicler. I was tasked with recording information provided by Chris, and then distributing said information to the Quickie, and, by extension, the Kiwi Farms. Bear in mind, I do not have all of the answers regarding the various mysteries surrounding Bella and her schemes, but there are things that I do know, and a few things that I suspect, and this is what I will share. I am Anaxis, aka Lane Chu the Chronicler. This is my story, and nothing less. I'm sure he's going to go into it, but the character of Lane Chu was one of the fictional personalities that the Watchmen used to kind of, control Chris. Basically, they pretended to be, a psychic Sonichu character, and the role of Lane Chu, which Chris believed to be one person, this fictional Lane Chu character, was played by multiple different people over the months and years that the Watchmen were in existence. So Anaxis was the third person to play the role of Lane Chu, which was a role that was used to sort of, dig into Chris's, delusions. The beginning, July 2020 through September 2020. I have been casually observing Chris since around 2016, about at the point when the Doopy saga was just beginning. I was fascinated and disgusted by Chris, intrigued and revolted. It was a lot to take in, and I remember there being a point where I would be procrastinating on responsibilities by reading the Quickie. It was a fun time sink for a while, but eventually, I read all of the major articles and grew bored. From then on, I would visit the wiki every so often, usually just to check a update and see what the latest news was regarding Chris. I never got involved in the community directly. I would always be incredibly passive about my observation. I never aspired to make a Quickie account or visit the Kiwi Farms. I would just check the website's front page, and later stay caught up with Gino Samuel's series. That all changed once the Quickie Discord server came into existence. On the 1st of July 2020, the official Quickie server was created by Klopp, and I joined it the very next day. I found myself in a community unlike any other that I had known. It had many different people of varying backgrounds and a wide span of opinions, but we all had one common attribute: our fascination with observing Chris. For the first time, I was surrounded by people who were willing to engage in discourse about him, and that was something that I found to be often very entertaining, even intellectually stimulating at times. Although I can't say that I was the biggest fan of the culture that often propagated around the server, I genuinely enjoyed discussing Christory, and so it was worth it to me. I would like to believe that I had some influence in shaping the server at the time, such as suggesting that we add separate channels for the discussion of Christory-related topics. I also firmly believed in the #1 rule that was established on the server, which followed a similar attitude to the wiki: do not contact Chris or attempt to troll him. Sadly, throughout my time on the server, I had come across many people who had broken that rule, and come to the server to brag about their accomplishment, only to find that their audience would not be receptive. Many users have been banned from the server for that very reason. One of the server moderators noticed my interest in analysis of Chris and Christory, and offered to make me an editor account, which I accepted. Arrival of the Watchmen. I had been on the server for about a month when the members of the group that would come to be known as the Watchmen began arriving. First and most prominently was Bismuth, going by the name Hart at the time, and who I will be referring to as Not for the remainder of this writing. He began releasing a large amount of assorted leaks regarding Chris, which would come to be known as the 2020 Discord leaks. Funny enough, one of my first interactions with Not was a rather hostile one. He was posting these leaks in a discussion channel, and I would occasionally comment on them. He got fed up with the interruptions and stopped posting leaks, resulting in an argument between us until he was given his own dedicated channel for leaks. Interestingly, this interaction didn't seem to end up characterizing the relationship we would later have, at least not at the start. Having been so heavily involved in the server from its inception, coupled with the fact that life had become exceedingly dull due to the then raging COVID-19 pandemic, I eventually approached the mod staff and asked if I could join them, and they said yes. Curiously, I was added to the mod staff by Klopp at the exact same time as Not, as Klopp had ties with the Watchmen at the time, and had been adding a few of their members to the mod staff as well, such as MKR. I was glad to be a part of the team, but my first real challenge as a moderator came from an event which had begun on the previous day. Chris, who was in the midst of role-playing as Sonichu at the time, arrived in the server on the 10th of August 2020, after Not had invited him in. At the time, the server had a contingency plan in place in the event that Chris showed up. He would be isolated into a single channel, only able to type in there, while individuals who were seen as sane and reasonable would be given a role called True and Honest, and only they would be allowed to speak to Chris, to ask questions and the like. However, news of Chris's arrival on the server spread quickly, resulting in an influx of new users desperate to approach him and interact with him in some way, whether that be trolling, asking questions, or just having a chat. Ultimately, Chris only sent 2 messages during his time in the server, both of which had to do with the dimensional merge. By the 14th of August, it was decided that the trouble of having Chris on the server was simply not worth it, and ultimately conflicted with the server's philosophy of not interacting with him. During this time, Klopp was the one who played Laneshoe, a role that was created for the purpose of documenting Chris and relaying relevant information back to the Quickie, and was a member of the Watchmen. Since Chris's arrival on the Quickie server, Klopp had been working on creating another server for the purposes of filtered information with Chris's fans via the Watchmen, in order to separate the Quickie server from Chris. On the day of Chris's banning, Klopp posted an announcement about it as well as a link to the new server, called Quick Friends. Klopp's statement on Chris's banning read, "In the last few days, lots have happened in this server. Chris has joined this place for starters. This was met with mixed reception. The Quickie's goal is only to document Chris and not provide him a platform to push his agendas. It was never imagined that Chris will use this server to ramble about his fantasies, and due to this, it has been decided to give Chris his own server where he may do as he pleases." Anaxis continues. However, setup was not finished, and the server was quickly infested by weens, forcing the moderators to take control of the situation. Chris himself wasn't even there yet, although he would arrive eventually. Klopp gave ownership to Not, who would run the Quick Friend server until its eventual closure less than a month later. At the time, he handed ownership of the Quickie server to another moderator. I don't know exactly what happened, but he seemed to have a change of heart in regards to dealing with Chris, although this would be brief. But this was the event that jump-started my involvement. Klopp decided that he no longer wanted to play the part of Laneshoe, and, having confided in me beforehand about playing the role, offered it to me. I considered the pros and cons. There is an inherent risk when being so close to Chris, of course, and I wasn't interested in drawing attention to myself. On the other hand, This was an interesting opportunity to observe Chris a bit closer, and even relay new information back to the Quickie using my then newly created editor account. And so, I decided to accept Klopp's offer, if only I knew the consequences of this decision that would arise a little less than a year later. Joining the Watchmen. A member of the Watchmen would reach out to me soon after, giving me an invite to their server, The Place. Within it were 2 layers of channels, one which was visible to Chris and everybody else, and a second which was visible to everybody excluding Chris. It was here that I formally met several members of the Watchmen for the first time, such as MKR Nightv, Nova Kyle, and Neko Onyx / The Wildcat. It was pretty quiet upon arrival, not quite knowing how I fit in, not having been given any instruction for my role. As it turned out, it didn't end up mattering at first. Klopp had returned to the Watchmen, and since I had not done anything as Lane Chu yet, decided to take the role back temporarily. This was fine by me. I was mostly interested in more distant documentation anyway. I got into the habit of screenshotting conversations whenever Chris was involved, and some of these conversations made up the substance of the early Discord Q&A, such as Q&As 2 and 3. I would upload these screenshots as references in the articles, with the names of the Watchmen, besides Lane Chu, censored. The Q&A itself was very impromptu and generally disorganized, and there was a rather large plethora of questions to be picked from. This was not to mention sourcing from quick friends, which involved not acting as a go-between for Chris, answering questions in his stead, although the volatile nature of the poorly managed server, coupled with Nott's general impatience toward less-informed Chris observers, made it difficult to organize that effectively. By the end of August, Klopp decided to give up the role of Lane Chu, this time for good, choosing to disassociate himself with the Watchmen and the Quick community entirely. Once again, he asked me if I wanted it, and I accepted. He left for a fair amount of time, but would eventually return to the Quickie server every so often to check in on things, becoming Lane Chu. The migratory nature of the Lane Chu role put me in an interesting position. I was more or less able to pick up where Klopp left off, having already formed a relationship of sorts with Chris. To him, Lane Chu the Chronicler was meant to be not only a historian who would document what Chris wanted, but a kind of sage who would give advice on how Chris could get closer to the dimensional merge. I initially carried on like nothing was different, waiting and watching for Chris to say something noteworthy in The Place. So it came to my complete surprise when he messaged me privately one day, early in September, entirely out of the blue. He came asking me questions about bringing the dimensional merge closer to fruition, and initially, I didn't quite know how to respond. Up to that point, I purposefully avoided speaking to Chris, specifically because I didn't want to have to enable him, but here I was stuck. Either I play the game with him and keep him talking, or I refuse and he clams up. At this point, I went to Nott for help deciphering the nonsense that I was being sent, as well as advice on how to respond, and he gave me a general idea of how to speak to Chris from then on. Chris's desperation and desire to bring about the merge was evident, and the last thing I wanted to do was promise him something that would never come, so I developed a strategy. Whenever I would be asked a question about accelerating the event into existence, I would go full Zen master, preaching about the virtues of patience and allowing fate to take its natural course. I would always be just vague enough that I could be giving wisdom on anything. On occasion, early on, I would go back to Nott for specific advice when Chris was being particularly difficult, but soon I got the hang of things and stopped asking for his advice altogether. It was around this point that I began rising through the ranks of the mod staff on the Quickie server, eventually joining the small group of managerks at the top of the command structure. Having seen the general inefficiency through which questions were delivered to Chris for the Q&A, and having ready access to a fairly sizable group of individuals interested in having their queries answered by Chris, I set to work on creating a new, separate server that would avoid the issues brought about by the mailbags attempted in Quick Friends and elsewhere, by taking Chris out of the equation completely. The new server would be a repository for questions directed towards Chris, moderated by myself and a select few from the Quickie server, where we would separate the wheat from the chaff and ensure that only non-trolling questions of quality, in our opinions, would reach Chris. Officially, we would forward them to the Watchmen after the review, which was technically correct, as Lane Chu would be the one asking these questions to Chris on the user's behalf. The server was dubbed Quick Questions, and would serve as the primary source of questions for the rest of the Q&A, from Discord Q&A 5 until its conclusion with Discord Q&A 11. The Quick Friend server came to an unceremonious end on 6th of September, with Nott, fed up by having to wrangle Weens, deciding to wipe the slate clean and create a different server from scratch that would serve a similar purpose, although this ultimately never saw the light of day. 2 days later, Quick Questions launched, and we began gathering inquiries. I would send them to Chris a few hours later, as he had messaged me asking for more merge wisdom the day previous, and he answered them, allowing me to post the screenshots directly onto the Quickie on their own page. Systems for both vetting questions server-side and delivering them to Chris in DMs were established, with me sending relevant questions to Chris in a set of 10 at a time, and reminding him once a week about the questions if he neglected to answer them, which was frequent. This system would last until the Q&A's end in December 2020. On enabling Chris and my intentions. I am fully aware of the morally questionable implications of my choice to enable Chris, as well as the negative perception that comes with doing so. Enablers are frowned upon in the Quick community, and with good reason. They perpetuate, and oftentimes, add to Chris's unhealthy delusions, furthering him down a destructive path. I'm not here to tell you that I'm some exception to the rule, or that I deserve any less amount of flack for playing along with Chris's craziness. I only wish to explain why I did the things that I did, and give some context to my actions. The sad reality about modern Chris, as any Christorian worth their salt would tell you, is that he will not willingly engage with anyone who does not play along with his delusions, including people who try to help him. Noel found this out the hard way, when Chris grew upset with him initially refusing to entertain Chris's merge nonsense in the aftermath of the Idea Guys. Thus, if you were going to speak to Chris, you either had to acknowledge his delusions quietly, or discuss them in great depth. The latter opinion was not appealing to me, so I chose the former. I dubbed this technique light enabling. As mentioned earlier, I would usually send him vague wisdoms whenever he would ask about the merge, having to do with patience and allowing fate to take its natural course. My number one rule when dealing with Chris, which I also enforced when evaluating Q&A questions, was, don't give Chris any new ideas. I would always strive to maintain the status quo of Chris's beliefs for as long as possible since they could not be removed, as opposed to enablers who attempted to insert their own lore into Christery. To me, this was the ideal modus operandi of the Watchmen when regarding Chris, although whether it was followed by the others is an entirely different story. My first priority when speaking to Chris was the gathering of more information, by way of the Q&A. If light enabling was required on some level to get there, then so be it. All that I wanted was information that I could upload to the Quickie. Nothing more, nothing less. Only once did I break my self-imposed rule of not adding new lore in an act of desperation, which I will cover later. I've seen a few people here and there theorize that I was a troll or a ween. Unless the mere act of speaking to and enabling Chris qualifies me as such, I disagree with this assessment. I never tried to troll, or otherwise antagonize Chris, and I had no desire for glory, clout, or a place in Christery. I never took credit for any of the actions I did as Lane Chew, and the only reason I'm doing so now is because the cat is already out of the bag. Unlike some people, I don't view being in Christery as a badge of honor. If anything, it's the opposite. I just wanted to make a few small contributions by way of information releases. Some might also call me a hypocrite for preaching the observe don't interact philosophy when it came to Chris while interacting with Chris myself, which I suppose is a fair criticism. I did try to maintain this philosophy for as long as possible, even as a member of the Watchmen, until Chris spoke to me first. In my mind, I justified it as him having reached out to me, rather than the other way around, which was far more typical of those wanting Chris's attention, and thus it was not the same case. I also believed myself to be making contributions to Christery by way, once again, of information releases, making speaking to Chris a necessary evil. While I do feel like the ends justified the means in terms of what I got out of Chris during the time we spoke, I am still uneasy with having spoken directly to him in order to do so. If I've let anyone down, especially from the Quickie server, I apologize. I do not expect to be taken solely at my word on this matter, so I encourage you to look at my DMs with Chris, which I am currently updating and will eventually be posted in their entirety, to draw your own conclusions about my intentions. I hope that you find them illuminating. Coming soon, the Days of Prosper, September 2020 through December 2020. From September to December 2020, things were fairly good over on Discord. During this period, I became the owner of the Quickie server, and began committing time to improving it in different aspects. Chris would answer the Q&A every so often, each time prompting me to make a new page. Relations with most of the Watchmen were fairly good, at least on the surface. In retrospect, it was the calm before the storm. Stay tuned for updates. And that is the post so far, as of April 23rd, 2023. Obviously, there at the end, Anaxis has promised that there will be further updates in the future, although, as we all should know by now, any project that involves Quick-related things may face some scrutiny that then causes the person to not continue the project. So it is unclear whether or not there's going to be a part 2, but when there is, obviously I will go and I will read it, and I will then label this video as a part 1. Thank you for watching. If you want more information about Chris Chan, make sure to subscribe, and if you want up-to-the-minute updates about Chris Chan and any news events that happen that are important, groundbreaking. Maybe one day his trial will actually happen. If you want more quick, that's a pun. If you want more quick updates, you can follow me on Twitter at GiBi_Devin. Thank you for watching.